15 years after my adoptive family disowned me for a theft I never committed, their investment bank slid a confidential acquisition file across my conference table and asked if Voss Capital Partners might be interested in rescuing a struggling wealth management firm called Kessler Advisors. I opened the file, saw my own childhood address listed as the corporate headquarters, and had to set my coffee down before my hand gave away exactly how personal this particular deal was about to become. My name is Adrian Voss. I'm 39 years old. I run an investment firm in Chicago that manages just under $2 billion in client assets. And for the first 39 minutes of that meeting, not one person in the room knew that the name on my company's door used to belong to two people who died on a rain-slicked overpass on Interstate 55 when I was 5 years old, or that I'd spent 18 years of my life answering to an entirely different last name before I finally, deliberately, took my own name back. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly what was built and exactly what was broken before you can appreciate what happened in that conference room. My birth parents, Marcus and Elena Voss, died in a multi-car pileup on I-55 outside Bloomington when I was 5. I don't remember much about them directly. The human mind is merciful that way with early trauma. But I remember the smell of my mother's coat, and I remember a song my father used to hum while he drove, though I've never been able to place which one. I spent 8 months in the foster system before Douglas and Helen Kessler adopted me. Douglas ran a boutique wealth management firm out of Oak Brook, Illinois, founded by his own father in the 1960s, the kind of firm that measured its success in decades-long client relationships rather than quarterly numbers. Helen taught piano lessons out of their home 3 afternoons a week and had, by every account I ever heard, wanted a third child desperately after 2 difficult pregnancies had left her unable to safely carry another. I was 6 years old when I moved into their house on Ridgeview Lane, and for the first several years of my life there, I genuinely believed I had landed in the luckiest circumstance imaginable. Douglas and Helen already had 2 biological children. Sterling was 2 years older than me, sharp, competitive, groomed almost from birth to eventually take over Kessler Advisors, a fact he reminded everyone of constantly and with visible pride. Vivian was 1 year younger, quieter than Sterling, but no less watchful, the kind of child who noticed everything and said very little about most of it until it mattered. I want to be fair to both of them, even now, even after everything. They didn't torment me as a small child. There was no obvious cruelty in those early years, no fairy tale wickedness. What there was instead was something quieter and more corrosive, something I didn't have a language to identify until I was much older. A low, persistent current of resentment that ran beneath nearly every interaction, the sense communicated in 1,000 small ways that I was a guest in a house that belonged, by blood, to someone else. Douglas and Helen never once made me feel that way directly. If anything, they overcorrected, praising my grades a little too loudly at family dinners, showing up to every school event with the specific enthusiasm of parents determined to prove something to themselves. I understand now that their overcorrection, however well-intentioned, was its own kind of fuel for what Sterling and Vivian were quietly building underneath the surface of our childhood. Every time Douglas praised my report card, I watched Sterling's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Every time Helen hugged me a little longer after a rough day at school, I caught Vivian watching from the doorway with an expression I couldn't fully read until years later, when I finally understood it as a child's early education in keeping score. I joined Kessler Advisors straight out of business school at 24, the same as Sterling had 3 years earlier, the same path Douglas had walked with his own father decades before. I want to be honest about something that matters enormously to the rest of this story. I was good at the job. Not good in some vague, self-flattering way. Genuinely, measurably good. The kind of good that shows up in client retention numbers and referral rates rather than office politics. I built relationships with clients the way Douglas had taught all 3 of us to, patiently, honestly, treating every portfolio like it belonged to someone's entire future rather than a line item on a quarterly report. Within 2 years, I'd built a book of business that rivaled Sterling's, despite starting 3 years behind him. And I want to be clear that I never once tried to compete with him directly. I simply worked the way I've been raised to work, and the numbers followed. Sterling, I would learn much later, experienced every one of those numbers as a direct threat to the succession plan he'd spent his entire life assuming was owed to him by birthright rather than earned through performance. The theft, when it happened, was engineered with a patience that still, even now, makes my stomach turn when I think about it too closely. It was late October, 16 years ago. I was 26, 2 years into the job, running point on a handful of mid-sized client trust accounts that Douglas had recently handed me as a vote of confidence. The kind of responsibility that normally didn't land on an associate my age for at least another 2 or 3 years. I didn't know at the time, but that vote of confidence was, in Sterling's eyes, the final straw. Here's what I pieced together, slowly and painfully, over the following months and years. Though I want to be honest that I didn't have anything close to the full picture until much, much later. Sterling and Vivian, working together, routed $340,000 out of one of my client trust accounts through a shell entity registered under a name close enough to a legitimate vendor Kessler Advisors regularly used that a distracted auditor might miss the discrepancy on a first pass. The transfers were timed and structured to route through credentials tied to my login, credentials I genuinely, carelessly left active on a shared workstation during a chaotic week when our IT contractor was mid-migration to a new system and half the office was borrowing terminals. I want to own that carelessness honestly. Even now, it wasn't a crime. It was an ordinary, forgivable lapse in a stressful week. But it was exactly the kind of small opening a patient, calculating person needs to build an entire case around. The audit that uncovered the missing funds happened 3 weeks later, run by an outside compliance firm Douglas had brought in as part of a routine regulatory review. I remember the specific afternoon Douglas called me into his office, the door closed, which almost never happened between us. His face was gray in a way I'd never seen before. He slid a printout across the desk, transaction logs with my login credentials stamped across every line of the fraudulent transfer chain. "Adrian," he said, and I remember his voice shaking slightly. "I need you to explain this to me." I looked at those logs and felt the floor of my entire life tilt sideways in real time. I had no explanation because I hadn't done it, and innocence, I learned that week, is a remarkably difficult thing to prove against a paper trail engineered specifically to survive scrutiny. I want to walk through the days that followed carefully, because I've turned them over in my mind more times than any other stretch of my life, searching for the moment I could have fought harder, said something differently, found some crack in the frame that I simply didn't see fast enough. Douglas Broad and the firm's attorney within 48 hours. Sterling, I remember with painful clarity, sat in on that meeting with an expression of grave, sorrowful concern that I mistook, at the time, for genuine worry on my behalf. Vivian didn't attend at all, which I understand now was its own kind of strategic distance. The attorney laid out the options with the flat, procedural calm of a man who'd delivered this particular kind of news many times before. Kessler Advisors could file a formal complaint with regulators and pursue criminal charges, which would likely result in prosecution given the documentary evidence. Or I could resign immediately, sign a release waiving any claim to equity or future inheritance in the firm, and the matter would be handled internally, quietly, with no criminal referral. I said, more times than I can count in that meeting, that I hadn't done it. Douglas looked at me with an expression I still think about, some complicated mixture of grief and doubt that told me, even before he said anything, that the evidence had done exactly what it was designed to do. "Adrian, I want to believe you," he said, and I remember thinking, even in the middle of my own devastation, that wanting to believe someone and actually believing them are two entirely different things, and that gap between them was about to cost me everything. Helen cried through most of that meeting without saying much of anything at all, caught, I understood only years later, between a husband she trusted completely and a son she'd raised since he was 6 years old, unable to reconcile the two competing realities the moment demanded she choose between. I signed a release. I want to be honest about why, because it's the part of this story that took me the longest to make peace with. I signed it partly because the attorney made it clear that fighting the criminal complaint would mean months, possibly years, of legal proceedings I couldn't afford, against a documentary trail specifically engineered to survive exactly that kind of scrutiny. But I signed it mostly because Douglas, the man who'd given me his name and his home and what I believed for 18 years was his unconditional love, looked at me like he wasn't entirely sure who I was anymore. I couldn't stay in a house where that particular doubt lived in the room with me. I signed a release, packed 2 suitcases, and left Oak Brook, Illinois, 26 years old. My name legally still Kessler, but my place in that family permanently, irreversibly severed. I changed my name back to Voss within the year, a decision that took considerably less legal effort than I expected and considerably more emotional effort than I anticipated. My birth parents had been dead for over 20 years by then, and I barely remembered them, but reclaiming their name felt like the only thing I had left that nobody could fabricate evidence against. I moved to Chicago, took a considerable pay cut at a mid-tier investment firm willing to overlook the messy, unverifiable story behind my departure from Kessler Advisors, and started building something that belonged entirely to me, with no family name attached to prop it up or, as it turned out, tear it down. The next several years were the hardest of my adult life, harder in some ways than the theft itself, because grief has an ending and rebuilding doesn't. Not for a long time. I worked 80-hour weeks. I slept in my office more nights than I'd like to admit. I built a client base one relationship at a time, the same patient, honest way Douglas had taught me before everything fell apart. Except now I was doing it without his name, without his reputation, without the 18 years of trust his firm had built before I ever walked through its doors. By 31, I'd saved enough to start my own shop. By 35, Voss Capital Partners managed just under $1 billion in client assets. By the time I turned 39, that number had nearly doubled, and I'd built, from absolutely nothing, exactly the kind of firm Douglas Kessler had once told me, in a rare unguarded moment when I was 19, that he hoped I'd be capable of building someday. I just built it 15 years later than either of us expected, and I'd built it entirely alone. I want to be honest about something else. I didn't spend those 15 years plotting revenge. I know that's not the satisfying version of this story, but it's the true one. I spent those 15 years genuinely trying not to think about Oak Brook at all, because thinking about it reopened a wound I'd worked very hard to let scar over. I heard occasional updates through the small, gossipy world of Chicago area finance. Douglas's health declining, Sterling taking over as CEO around year 8, Vivian moving into a senior compliance role that struck me, when I heard about it, as a specific and almost unbearable irony given everything I knew and everything I still couldn't prove. I heard, more recently, whispers that Kessler Advisors had grown considerably more aggressive under Sterling's leadership, chasing higher yield, higher risk strategies that didn't match the patient, conservative philosophy his own father had built the firm on. I filed all of it away in the part of my mind reserved for a chapter of my life I'd already closed. I never once expected that chapter to reopen itself, unprompted, on my own conference table. The acquisition file landed on my desk on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered through Haller & Bishop, an investment bank Voss Capital had worked with on 4 previous deals, brought to us by a managing director named Cassandra Ilford who had absolutely no idea what she was actually walking into. "Confidential opportunity," she said, sliding the folder across the table in our Chicago conference room. "Boutique wealth management firm, strong historical client base, currently facing a liquidity crunch after some aggressive positioning decisions went sideways over the past 18 months. They need a buyer with both capital and, frankly, a credible reputation, fast before this becomes public and the client exodus turns into a stampede." I opened the folder. Kessler Advisors, Oak Brook, Illinois, founded in 1968. I looked at the corporate address listed on the cover page and recognized it immediately as the street 2 blocks from the house I'd grown up in, the same street I used to walk down every morning to catch the school bus. I kept my face perfectly still, the same professional stillness I'd trained into myself over 15 years of client meetings, while something considerably less professional turned over completely in my chest. "Tell me about the leadership situation," I said, keeping my voice level, curious in the ordinary, procedural way any acquirer would sound reviewing a distressed target. Cassandra pulled up her notes. "CEO's a man named Sterling Kessler. Founder's son. Took over about 7 years ago. Chief Compliance Officer is his sister, Vivian Kessler Ambrose. The founder, Douglas Kessler, is still listed as Chairman Emeritus, though for what I understand his health hasn't allowed active involvement in years. Their mother, Helen, isn't formally on the org chart, but apparently still holds a minority equity stake from the original founding structure. Douglas's health hasn't allowed active involvement in years. I sat with that sentence a long moment, feeling something complicated and unresolved move through me that I didn't have a clean name for. What caused the liquidity crunch specifically? I asked. Cassandra flipped to a summary page. Sterling apparently pushed the firm hard into a series of concentrated positions in a handful of speculative growth sectors starting around 4 years ago, moving away from the conservative, diversified approach that built the firm's original reputation. Worked well for about 2 years. Then it didn't. They're facing significant client withdrawal requests they can't currently cover without a capital infusion. And there's an open regulatory inquiry into how client communications about risk exposure were handled during the build-up. An open regulatory inquiry. I thought about the attorney's office 16 years earlier, the flat procedural calm with which he'd explain my own options. I wondered, with a coldness that surprised even me, whether Sterling was currently sitting through a similar conversation, on the other side of a similar desk, discovering what it actually felt like to have his own name and his own signature scrutinized by people who weren't inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt. I want full diligence materials, I told Cassandra. Complete financials, compliance history, everything going back at least 10 years, not just the recent crisis window. She looked slightly surprised at the specificity of the request, but nodded, already making notes. That's a fairly deep dive for an initial look, Adrian. I like to understand exactly what I'm buying, I said, which was true, though not remotely for the reason she assumed. I called my head of forensic accounting into my office that same afternoon, a meticulous, unflappable woman named Priya Anand who'd worked with me for 9 years and had never once, in that entire time, seen me request a diligence package with the particular intensity one brought to the Kessler file. I want everything, I told her, not just the last 18 months. Everything the data room will give us, going back as far as it goes. Trust account histories, compliance audit trails, personnel records if they're in there, all of it. Priya studied me a moment, the specific look of someone who'd worked closely enough with a person to notice when something personal was moving underneath a professional request. Is there something specific you're looking for? There might be, I said. I'll know it if I see it. Priya's team spent the following 3 weeks buried in Kessler Advisors' data room, and I want to describe what happened next as carefully and honestly as I can, because it's the part of this story people find hardest to believe, even though every word of it is true. Compliance audit trails from a firm as old as Kessler Advisors, it turns out, are considerably more permanent than anyone involved in framing me 16 years earlier apparently anticipated. Financial services firms are required to retain detailed records for regulatory purposes far longer than most people realize, and Kessler Advisors, despite 2 changes in compliance software over the intervening years, had maintained an unbroken archival chain going back over 2 decades, the exact kind of institutional memory Douglas Kessler had always insisted on, precisely the kind of thoroughness that had built the firm's original reputation for trustworthiness. Sterling and Vivian, I would come to understand, had built their frame 16 years earlier to survive a compliance audit conducted with 2010's era forensic tools. They had never once imagined it might eventually be excavated by a forensic accounting team, working with tools 2 full technology generations more sophisticated, hired by the exact person they framed, 16 years later, under a completely different name. Priya found it on a Thursday evening, staying late the way she often does when something in the data has snagged her attention and won't let go. She called me at home around 9, which she'd never once done in 9 years of working together. Adrian, I need you to come look at something. I think I found what you were looking for, though I don't fully understand yet why you were looking for it. I drove to the office. She had 3 monitors arranged around her desk, transaction logs and metadata pulled up across all of them, IP address records, log and timestamp data, internal messaging archives that had been migrated, apparently without anyone at Kessler Advisors fully realizing it, into the newer compliance system during a platform upgrade 11 years earlier. This trust account discrepancy from 16 years ago, she said, pointing a screen. $340,000, routed through a shell vendor account. It's flagged in an old internal audit as resolved, employee terminated, no further action. My chest tightened. Keep going. The transaction metadata, shows the transfers were initiated from a workstation IP address. She continued, pulling up a second screen, and I cross-referenced that IP against the building's network logs from that period, which somehow survived in an old backup archive nobody's touched in over a decade. The workstation used to initiate the fraudulent transfers wasn't the one assigned to the employee who was terminated. She looked at me directly. It was assigned to someone named Sterling Kessler. I sat down slowly in the chair beside her desk. "There's more," Priya said, and I could hear, even in her carefully professional voice, that she understood by now this wasn't a routine diligence finding. Internal messaging archive, same week, between Sterling Kessler and a Vivian Kessler. I'm not going to pretend I fully understand the family dynamics here, Adrian, but I think you should read these yourself. She turned the monitor toward me. I read messages I'd spent 16 years wondering whether they'd ever existed in any recoverable form. And there they were, time-stamped, unambiguous, exactly as damning as I'd once desperately hoped some piece of evidence, somewhere, might eventually turn out to be. Sterling, writing to Vivian 4 days before the audit. Adrian's numbers this quarter are going to make it impossible for Dad to justify keeping the succession plan the way it's structured. We need this handled before the board review. Vivian's response, 11 minutes later. The trust account transfers are set up. Should route clean through the vendor shell. Just make sure you're not logged into your own terminal when it processes. I read that exchange 3 times, sitting in Priya's office at nearly 10 at night. 16 years of carefully managed grief and carefully suppressed rage arriving all at once in a data room on a Thursday, because 2 people who'd once shared a dinner table with me had never once imagined their own institutional record-keeping might eventually betray them. Adrian. Priya's voice was quiet. Who are these people to you? I looked at her a long moment, deciding, finally, after 16 years, exactly how much of this story I was ready to say out loud to another living person. Sterling and Vivian Kessler, I said slowly, are my adoptive brother and sister. Douglas Kessler adopted me when I was 6 years old. I worked at that firm for 2 years before they framed me for exactly the theft or data, just prove they committed themselves, and I signed away my inheritance and my name rather than fight a criminal complaint I had no real way to be at the time. Priya sat back in her chair, absorbing that in silence for a long moment. 16 years, she finally said. And now they need you to save the company. They don't know it's me, I said. Sterling and Vivian have no reason to connect Adrian Voss of Voss Capital Partners with a brother they haven't spoken to in 16 years, under a name I only started using after I left. Priya considered that. What do you want to do with this? I thought about it a long time before I answered. I want to close the deal, I finally said. On my terms. And I want everyone in that family to understand exactly what they're signing before they sign it. I want to be honest about the several days that followed, because I spent them wrestling with a version of myself I didn't entirely recognize, someone who'd spent 16 years building a reputation on patient, honest dealing, now sitting on evidence that could destroy 2 people who'd once destroyed him, deciding exactly how much of that destruction he actually wanted to deliver. I called my attorney, a sharp, exacting woman named Renata Okafor, who'd handled Voss Capital's acquisitions for the better part of a decade and had never once, in that time, heard anything about my life before Chicago. I told her everything, start to finish, the same way I'd told Priya, and watched her expression shift from professional attentiveness to something considerably more personal by the time I finished. Adrian, I need to ask you directly, she said. Do you want to pursue criminal charges against Sterling and Vivian based on this evidence? Because we could. This is more than sufficient for a regulatory referral, and likely a criminal complaint, 16 years old or not. I thought about that question longer than any other question in the entire process. No, I finally said. Not criminal charges. I want something more precise than that. Which is, I want to buy the company, I said. I want to structure the deal so Sterling and Vivian have no operational role in what happens next, ever again. I want Helen protected, financially and personally, because whatever she failed to do 16 years ago, I don't believe she was ever part of building the frame in the first place. And I want them to hear the truth directly from me, in a room, before anything gets signed. Not as a lawsuit, as a fact they finally have to sit with. Renata studied me a long moment. That's considerably more restraint than most people would manage with evidence like this sitting on the table. I've had 16 years to decide what I actually wanted instead of what I initially wanted, I told her. The initial version involved considerably more shouting. The deal moved forward through Haller and Bishop exactly as any distressed acquisition would. Financial terms negotiated, staffing plans discussed, all of it conducted at the professional remove of intermediaries who had no idea the buyer already knew, in granular and devastating detail, exactly what had happened inside that firm 16 years earlier. Cassandra Ilford, to her credit, ran an extremely competent process, and by early May we'd reached the point every acquisition eventually reaches, the closing meeting, where principals from both sides finally sit in the same room to sign what intermediaries have spent months negotiating on paper. I requested that meeting happen in person at the Kessler Advisors offices in Oak Brook, a request Cassandra found slightly unusual for a deal of this size, but didn't push back on. I hadn't set foot in that building in 16 years. I wanted to walk back into it on my own terms, for the first time in my life, entirely on my own terms. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May, dark-tailored suit, the same measured, unhurried composure I bring to every closing meeting I've conducted in 15 years of building Voss Capital Partners. Cassandra met me in the lobby, ran through the agenda one final time, mentioned that Sterling, Vivian, and their mother Helen would all be present given the family's equity structure. Their attorney will be there too, she added. Standard for a deal this size. I nodded, betraying nothing, and followed her toward the same conference room where, 16 years earlier, an attorney had explained to a 26-year-old version of me exactly how thoroughly his life was about to be dismantled. Sterling had aged in the particular way that stress ages certain kinds of men, thinner than I remembered, a tightness around his eyes that suggested considerably more sleepless nights than his tailored suit was designed to disguise. Vivian looked sharper, more composed, though I noticed her hands moving slightly on the table in front of her, an old childhood habit I remembered from family dinners decades earlier, the same restless fingers she used to drum against the table whenever she was working hard to appear calmer than she felt. Helen sat between them, considerably older than the woman in my memory, her hair fully silver now, her hands folded in her lap with the particular stillness of someone who'd learned, over many difficult years, to hold herself steady regardless of what was happening around her. None of them recognized me, not for the first 4 minutes of that meeting, through introductions and pleasantries and Cassandra's opening summary of the deal structure. I watched Sterling's eyes pass over my face with the mild, professional interest of a man meeting his company's potential savior, absolutely no recognition registering anywhere behind them. Before we moved to signatures, I said, once Cassandra finished her opening remarks, my voice level, unhurried, the same voice I use closing every deal I've ever built. I'd like to say a few things directly to the Kessler family, if everyone's comfortable with that. Cassandra glanced at me, slightly surprised, but nodded and stepped back. Sterling's attorney, a cautious man named Whitfield Marsh, straightened slightly, sensing something shifting in the room's temperature that he couldn't yet name. Of course, Sterling said, still entirely unsuspecting. We're grateful for your interest in preserving what our family built. I'll let that sentence sit in the room a moment. What our family built. I want to start, I said, with a story about a workstation IP address from 16 years ago. The room went very still. Sterling's expression flickered, the first crack of something uncertain crossing his face. I'm sorry, he said. 16 years ago, I continued, my voice still level, still unhurried. $340,000 was routed out of a client trust account through a shell vendor entity. The transfer was structured to implicate a 26-year-old associate whose login credentials happened to be active on a shared workstation that week. That associate was terminated, signed away his equity and his name, and left this firm believing, for 16 years, that he'd been the victim of a crime he could never actually prove. Vivian's hand stopped moving entirely. Helen's eyes had gone very wide, moving between Sterling and me with an expression I recognized instantly. The same complicated mixture of grief and dawning understanding I remembered from her face 16 years earlier, except pointed in an entirely different direction now. I don't understand what this has to do with our transaction, Sterling said, his voice tighter than it had been 30 seconds earlier. My forensic accounting team, I continued, ignoring the question entirely, conducted a full diligence review of your compliance archives as part of our acquisition process. Archives, I should mention, that survived 2 software migrations and 11 years of backup redundancy, considerably more intact than I imagine anyone at this table ever anticipated. I opened the folder in front of me, slid a single printed page across the table towards Sterling. The transfers that framed that associate 16 years ago were initiated from a workstation IP address assigned to you, Sterling. And the internal messaging archive from that same week contains a fairly detailed conversation between you and your sister about making sure the transfers went through cleanly while you weren't logged into your own terminal. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I could hear the building's ventilation system cycling somewhere overhead. Sterling stared at the page in front of him without picking it up, his face draining of color in slow, visible stages. Vivian had gone completely rigid beside him. Helen's hand had come up to cover her mouth, her eyes fixed on me now with an intensity that told me some part of her, some instinct she hadn't fully let herself trust in 16 years, was already beginning to understand exactly who was sitting across that table from her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her directly, and for the first time since I'd walked into that room, I let 16 years of careful professional composure slip, just enough to let the truth through. "My name is Adrian Voss," I said. "It used to be Adrian Kessler." Helen's hand pressed harder against her mouth, a sound escaping from behind it that wasn't quite a word. "You were that associate," Sterling said slowly, his voice hollow, understanding arriving in real time. I'm the 26-year-old you framed for a theft you and Vivian committed together," I said, still level, still calm, though every word cost me considerably more composure than my voice let on. "I'm the son your parents raised for 18 years, and then chose not to believe when it mattered most. And I'm the buyer currently sitting across this table, holding the only capital infusion standing between this firm and total collapse." Whitfield Marsh, Sterling's attorney, had gone very still, clearly recalibrating an entire legal strategy in real time. "I want to be clear about something," I continued, before anyone could speak. "I'm not here to file criminal charges, though I have more than sufficient evidence to do so, and my own attorney can confirm that on the record right now, if anyone at this table wants to test that claim." Renata, seated beside me, nodded once, calm and precise. "I'm here to close an acquisition, but the terms of that acquisition are about to change, effective immediately, and I'd like everyone at this table to understand exactly why before we discuss what happens next." I laid out the revised terms slowly, deliberately, watching each piece land across 3 very different faces. The acquisition would proceed, Kessler Advisors clients protected, the firm's employees retained, the reputation Douglas Kessler had spent decades building preserved rather than allowed to collapse into public scandal. But Sterling and Vivian would have no operational role in the surviving entity. Effective that day, their equity bought out at a valuation considerably below what it would have commanded before their own mismanagement had driven the firm into crisis. Helen's minority stake, by contrast, would be protected in full, along with a personal seat on the new entity's advisory board if she wanted it, a gesture I made not out of any lingering need for her approval, but because I understood, watching her face across that table, that she'd spent 16 years carrying a version of this story she'd never been given the full truth to properly grieve. "You can't do this," Sterling said, his composure finally cracking entirely, something desperate and cornered entering his voice. "This is our family's company." It was I said. For 16 years I had no company, no family name, and no evidence anyone would believe. You built this outcome the day you decided a 26-year-old success threatened your inheritance enough to frame him for a crime you committed yourselves. I'm not doing anything to you today that you didn't already do to me first. I'm simply the version of it that happens to be legal, documented, and considerably more patient than what you engineered 16 years ago. Vivian, silent through most of the confrontation, finally spoke, her voice smaller than I remembered it, stripped of the careful composure she'd walked into the room with. "We were kids," she said. "Sterling was scared of losing everything Dad promised him. You were 24 and 25 years old," I said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. Old enough to understand exactly what you were doing to someone who'd never once tried to take anything from either of you. I worked hard because that's how Douglas raised all three of us to work. You decided my hard work was a threat instead of an example, and you built an entire fraud around that decision. I don't need you to understand that today. I need you to sign the revised terms in front of you. Helen hadn't said a word through most of it, tears moving steadily down her face by the time I finished speaking, but her eyes never left mine. Adrian, she finally said, my name landing strangely in a room that hadn't used it in 16 years. I need you to know I never stopped wondering. I told myself I believed the evidence because your father believed it, and I trusted him completely, and I've spent 16 years telling myself that was enough of a reason. It wasn't. I should have fought harder for you. I should have asked more questions. I let my own certainty about my husband override whatever instinct I had about my son, and I have lived with that specific failure every single day since you left this house. I sat with that a long moment, 16 years of carefully managed grief moving through me in ways I hadn't fully prepared for, even sitting in that room with every advantage, every piece of evidence, every ounce of leverage entirely on my side. I believe you, I finally said, and I meant it, watching something in her posture finally, slightly release. I'm not doing this to punish you, Helen. I never was. I came into this deal because Voss Capital needed a strong acquisition target, and I discovered, entirely by accident, that the target was you. What happens next between us, personally, is a separate conversation, one I'm willing to have, in time, if you want to have it. But it's not going to happen at a closing table with your other two children sitting on either side of you. The papers were signed within the hour, the revised terms exactly as I'd laid them out, Sterling and Vivian's signatures shaking slightly as they signed away operational control of the company they'd spent 16 years believing they'd secured permanently through the destruction of someone they'd once called their brother. Whitfield Marsh walked them out separately, the three of them barely speaking to one another in the hallway, the particular silence of people who've just watched an entire shared narrative collapse in real time. Helen stayed behind after the others left, and we sat together in that conference room for nearly an hour, the first real conversation we'd had in 16 years. She asked about my life, my company, whether I was happy, whether I'd found people who genuinely knew me the way she'd once believed she had. I answered honestly, all of it, the 80-hour weeks and the years sleeping in my office and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of a name that had once belonged to two people I barely remembered and now belonged, finally, entirely to me. She cried again, more than once, and near the end, she reached across the table and took my hand the way she used to when I was small, before everything, and asked if there was any version of this where she got to be part of my life again, not out of guilt, but because she genuinely missed me every single day for 16 years and had never once stopped believing, somewhere underneath the doubt Douglas had planted, that the boy she raised had been exactly who he always claimed to be. I didn't have a clean answer for her that day, and I told her so honestly. 16 years is a long time to rebuild trust in a single afternoon, and I wasn't willing to pretend otherwise just to give either of us a tidier ending than the situation actually deserved. What I told her instead was that I was willing to try, slowly, on terms that let both of us be honest about how much had been lost and how carefully whatever came next would need to be built. She accepted that, gratefully, the way people accept the only honest answer available to them after waiting 16 years for any answer at all. It's been 8 months since that closing meeting. Kessler Advisors operates now as a division of Voss Capital Partners, its client relationships intact, its employees retained, its reputation, against considerable odds, largely preserved. Helen serves on the advisory board, exactly as I offered, and calls me most Sundays now, tentative conversations that have grown steadily less tentative with time. Sterling and Vivian, last I heard through the same small, gossipy financial circles that once carried word of their rise, have both relocated out of state, their names no longer attached to any firm bearing the Kessler name. I don't know if they've made peace with what happened, or with each other, or with themselves. I've found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I don't need to know in order to feel finished with that particular chapter. I think, most days, about a version of this story where I walked into that conference room and simply filed a criminal complaint, let the legal system deliver whatever justice it was capable of delivering, and moved on without ever saying a single word to any of them directly. Some part of me still wonders whether that would have been the cleaner ending. But I don't think clean was ever really what I was looking for. I think what I actually wanted, underneath everything, was for the truth to finally exist somewhere outside my own memory, documented, undeniable, spoken out loud in the same room where it had once been buried. I got that. 16 years later than I once thought I might, and through a route considerably stranger than anything I'd have predicted at 26, sitting in that same conference room with my life dismantled in front of me. But I got it. And it turns out that's worth considerably more than the $340,000 this whole thing was originally built around. My name is Adrian Voss. It's the name my birth parents gave me, the name I carried for 5 years before I lost them, the name I reclaimed at 27 when the family that raised me decided my success was a threat worth destroying. I built an entire company under that name, from nothing, without a single dollar of inherited advantage. And when the family that once erased me finally needed saving, they needed my name to do it, even though, until the moment I said it out loud across that conference table, none of them had any idea it was the same name they'd once tried so hard to make sure I never used again.